Welcome to the first edition of Freedom Friday for 2022. This is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you will be freer after an hour with us today. I'm running a little bit solo this morning. Normally, we would have Sharif and myself, and we would have some friendly banter at the beginning of the show, and then we would get started. But today, Sharif is running just a little bit late. He had some things that starting last week that we knew he was going to have to take care of, so he will most likely be late. So I'm running solo to start the year off. So first, let me say to all of you, it's been a few weeks since we have done a Freedom Friday, and since we have seen you, and since then we have had a holiday, whichever holiday you celebrate at the end of the year, and then New Year's. So there's this artificial timeline, this bifurcation between 2021 and 2022 that we are observing and saying we are, in a new place now. It's a different year, and we're refreshed, hopefully, because we've had some time off. Truth is, the struggle continues. The truth is, everything that we were fighting for in last year is still an issue this year. I wrote a piece a couple of days ago about education in general during the pandemic, and it was basically to say that we're not out of the woods, we're not back, we're not, our kids aren't back to normal. We are adulting in a way that we never knew that we would have to do. We never knew when we became parents, especially those of us who are Gen X parents, that we would have a life-changing event that would throw everything into doubt and throw our normal struggles and our normal battles for equality and equity and social progress and racial progress. Those normal battles that we were already experiencing that were tough enough would be made even worse. That thing around, when America catches the flu, we get pneumonia. Well, when America gets pneumonia, what do we get? And that's where we are right now. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I hate to kick us off from the beginning when we're supposed to be happy and smiley and just really kind of jubilant about the fact that we have a fresh start, a brand new year. Truth is, our ancestors never got the fresh start, and neither are we. We are adulting, like I said, in a way that we never knew we would have to do. Anyways, today's guest is someone that I wanted to speak with last year, and we ran out of time for the year, so couldn't think of a better person to help us kick off this year, because my focus for this year, as it has always been, but more clarified than ever, is making sure that we can get a humane education for every young person, no matter what their background, where their situation is, where they are located geographically, socially, racially, to make sure that until we have systems that work equally well for every single young person, that our fight isn't over. That's my focus. So when I think about today's guest, David Johns, I can't think of anybody who has seen this issue from more perspectives that I really care about. The perspective of racial justice, the perspective of Black males. What are we doing for Black males? The perspective of what are we doing for girls? And, what's the deal with pushouts? From a policy perspective, what are we doing from the very top, from the White House all the way down to the grassroots? For an organizing perspective. But notice in all of these perspectives that I said, we haven't hit some of the even most marginalized of identities, that even some of us who think we're doing our best job with all the racial and social justice, we still have a blind spot. And that's for kids who happen to be from communities, families, or themselves that are gay, bisexual, lesbian, queer people. And schools, education systems, educators, or whatnot are deeply, deeply, deeply ignorant about these populations. And when people are ignorant about you, when they don't know you, they don't know your data, they don't know how you exist within their systems, it's easy to do anything to you and get away with it because you're so invisible. Guess what? You're not visible anymore. We're bringing in my guest today, our heavy hitter, soon to be Dr. David Johns. If you follow David Johns, we are manifesting this morning that we will be talking to Dr. David Johns. But just as a quick intro to friends and family, Dr. David Johns, as we are manifesting this morning, soon to be Dr. David Johns, has been the executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition, a civil rights organization since 2017, specifically with the focus on justice, period, but justice for Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. Today, we are dealing with youth, but of course, youth are connected to families and people and adults. So David has been a true warrior and ace for letting the invisible be made visible with these populations that we seem to just still in 2022 be so ignorant about. Just so ignorant about. Prior to that, in 2013, David was appointed to be the first executive director of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans. That's when I first met David. I want to say it was Philadelphia. Met you, David, in Philadelphia many years ago, and you did one of the best events that I still today will always rave about that I ever saw, because it was Philly youth all day long being the ones who were on stage, and adult folks were made to sit down and shut up and listen to youth all day long. And they ran the thing. I haven't seen anything like it since, and I had never seen anything like it before. And I think it's the right answer. David, I don't want this to sound like a eulogy, brother, but I really appreciate you coming on this morning.
Thank you. I appreciate you. I am a fan of your leadership and legacy, both you and Brother Elmeki. And I'm really, really thankful to our sister, Naomi Shelton, who ensured that this happened.
Naomi, our chief, our ace family member who puts people together. So we appreciate you, Naomi. And we know you are watching this morning, Naomi. So good morning. Naomi put in the comments, all but dissertation. So, and we love to give people a hard time about their dissertations on this show, because it is that hump. It is that hump that you got to get over. So
it's all about that present. Yeah.
So, David, when we think about making things visible that are invisible, when we think about working for systems that work equally well for everyone, I said this word several times as in the setup, ignorant. We are so ignorant about a population of young people, and I don't know why, but can you help me out just in starting there? What is our blind spot around queer youth, queer young people, their life, their existence, their stats, their existence, their role within society and within education? What are we missing that you are picking up on as you're pursuing your doctorate and your life's work?
Yeah, I appreciate that, and want to acknowledge that that's a really big question.
It's a huge question.
I want to step back, right? I want to step back, and I appreciate that you reminded people that I'm not new to this. I didn't just show up in this space talking about queer Black people. My entire career and life has been around the liberation of Black people, right? I love Black people. I love all of us. I love all parts of us. And something that I know as a student of Black theorists, race warriors, people who have always been intentional in disrupting what Black feminists call the matrix of domination is the blind spots exist by design. Right. And so we can't have this conversation about Black babies who have intersectional identities. And in this instance, we're talking about sexual identity, gender orientation, and expression. But we could also be naming and centering that most Black people have a disability. We're either born with one or made to have one as a result of how white supremacy works. Many of us are part of a religious minority in spite of the fact that Muslims are a global majority. Right. And so some of this is really about terms, and some of this is really about acknowledging that systems and frames and metaphors work exactly as designed. So specific to schools, right? And you know this, most of the people who follow you and those who do God's work, educators do God's work, know this, that public schools in this country were never designed for us. They were never really designed for poor people. They were never designed for Black people. They definitely weren't designed for Black people with intersectional identities. And I think for the purposes of starting this conversation, there are two things that are really important for me. One is so often we forget, as Asa Hillier reminds us, that children don't ask to be born. And so the thing that vexes me about so much of this is we use adult terms, political constructs that adults sometimes find discomfort in, right? An example is I don't use gay as an identifier, right? I use the term same gender loving, in part because gay is a social political construct that has been used to advance political goals and aims. Many of them have the unintended consequence of benefiting white gay men, white lesbian women thereafter. But often when people think about gay, the metaphor is working, so they think about gay white men. They also will then think about sex because of the way that we've socialized ourselves to thinking about behaviors and what is normal or not normal. And so I use a term same gender loving to be disruptive of all of that, to say that I exist both in my Blackness and in my same gender lovingness. And so I started by saying that we forget that kids don't ask to be born. And I named Asa Hilliard, a sociologist, as am I, because he talked about remembering that all of our babies are geniuses. What he said was, I've never met a child, in particular a Black child, who is not a genius. There's no secret to how we support them. We first acknowledge them as human, and we second support them with love. So now I'm going to land the plane, which is that Black babies and Black people and queer babies are not often seen as humans. Right? The terms exist. There's a book behind me, again, sociologist Irving Goffman talks about stigma. Stigma was something that was socially created. It was a broken contract that essentially said you were going to behave in a particular way. And when you did it, you were marked with a scarlet letter or a physical demarcation to show that you were different from everybody else. You were then ostracized. We no longer have to physically mark somebody. We simply use terms. We call them Black, or we call them poor, or we call them gay. And what that allows folks to do is to dismiss the need to honor humanity, to do the work of celebrating difference, both within groups and outside of groups, and otherwise showing up, honoring the work that as educators in this context, we subscribe to doing. The last point I'll make is this, and I want this to be a part of our framing, which is that the thing that often I struggle with in this context, having taught kindergarten and third grade and spent a lot of time thinking about development, is that our children are often not identifying as LGBTQIA+ in the way in which it works for adults. So they're not engaging in the vast majority of them, right? And I'm talking about students in middle school as well as in high school. What the research shows is that most of them now identify as anything other than strictly heterosexual. It's not because the gay agenda is working, and it's not we should be talking about that. What's at play often. But it's because young people are saying these binaries don't work. The systems of oppression are much more visible to them. And the reality is that right now, there are kids who are assumed to be LGBTQIA+, who do not have the same rights and protections as their peers. Right? Before the pandemic, so there's lots that we can talk about in terms of how things have been exacerbated, but all of this has to do with the wanton disregard for the humanity of people who have always been beautifully diverse and who challenge and who chip away at it, who highlight the ways that white supremacy and anti-Blackness function.
You know, and I'm sorry to ask you a compound question. I started out with a big question, a compound question, but it's the way that I wrestle with these issues as I look at policy. I look at the thing that I care about most is this morning there was a young person who woke up, who's living a life that not everybody gets to see all the pieces of that life in their mind, their thoughts, their hopes, their dreams, their things that they're holding tight to themselves, the things that they're working out internally. And they're going to go to a place called school where their peers may not understand that life. They're adults in that building. Maybe there's one person in that building who understands that secret set of thoughts that are going on in life. And that is a kid that's going to be alienated and potentially at higher risk for harm if they don't start entering school systems where we've thought about inclusion, not in some fake way, but in some way where it's okay for everybody to be who they are. For that child, for that young person, this might be a simpler question. What would be your message directly to that young person who is living in that silence and secrecy right now?
Yeah, happy to do that. And my heart just warmed as you asked me to do that. And I've done this before. What I will always say is that I see you, I value you, and I love you. And I want you to know that there's nothing wrong with you. You are not the problem. You are not a problem. The system is a problem. And as you were asking the question, I pulled up some of the data from my qualitative interviews because I'm asking Black, queer, trans, and non-binary students, middle and high school public students, about their experiences. And two of the big things that come up around this, which is that our babies don't feel safe, right? And there's a lot of research. GLSEN, I flagged this before, but GLSEN collaborated with NBJC to produce a series of reports. One of them is called Erasure and Resilience, the experience of LGBTQ students of color. And what it says is, and what we all know is that Black people have a really hard time in this country because of anti-Blackness. Queer people have a hard time in this country because of LGBTQ bias. And those of us who have intersectional experiences have compounded challenges that often go unnamed and not acknowledged in schools, in particular in schools in states where there are no promo homo laws, which make it difficult legally for anybody to have this kind of a conversation within a school context or confines. And all of that's really important for us to acknowledge. The other part that I'm sitting with is that so much of what you said, Chris, about the experiences of, in this context, specifically LGBTQ kids, is specific to all of them. Most young people are showing up in schools, if they're lucky, right? All of the safety concerns at present, trying to figure out who they are in a world that they didn't ask to be born into, and are doing so in ways that are always never fully available or accessible to other people. That's simply how our identities work. And Patricia Hill Collins, a Black feminist theorist, has spent a lot of time trying to help us understand that, along with Kimberly Crenshaw, that like there's beauty and there's space for freedom and liberation and coalition building in the intersections, where we all appreciate that even as Black people, there are differences amongst us that make us beautiful and individual in the way in which we show up, but there are also similarities and things that we should be able to bond over, including our shared humanity and desire to be free. And what I struggle with most with our babies is that people simply don't ask them about their experiences or their needs, right? And so one of the things that one of my research participants talked about was the difficulty of showing up in a school where you're always doing labor for people that just don't get it, right? And so there's a point where one of my interviewees, Aubrey, says, I feel like I've always had a really small circle because I don't explain myself. I don't like explaining myself. So when I'm able to be in a space where my existence is just understood and everything is taken at face value, then I don't have to explain myself. I feel most comfortable and most authentic then. And this for me is under this banner of safety, where Black kids and Black kids with intersectional identities have to master the system that they are going to be forced to be within, right? Our babies, our students, this came up at the White House Summit for African-American Youth that you mentioned, one of the events we hosted at Philly at UPenn, right? Like our babies are hyper aware of the expectations we have of them, what the things that we say about them mean for them now and in their future, right? Like they're doing all of this work and they're struggling to try and make connections to peers and adults who are parroting problematic ways of showing up in community with other people. And the thing that I hold on to is, and most educators know this, right? Like kids cannot demonstrate what they know, what they're passionate about if they don't feel safe, if they don't feel supported. The same is true for humans in terms of our interactions. And I really just want adults who have agency and the choice to choose another job or profession to appreciate that if you don't want to do this work of increasing competence and adopting new language, appreciating that we use people first language now, we say people with disabilities, we don't use any other terms. If you don't want to do that work, then find another profession, because the reality is that our babies are compelled by law to move through these spaces that they're required to go through to develop the skills, relationships, and credentials that they need in order to be successful and to otherwise thrive. And I think too often that part gets missed.
You know, it feels like when we are not allowing everyone to be who they want to be for whatever, season of their life, you look at the kid who, the boy who's wearing a tutu and everybody loses their mind. You go into the store aisles, you go into grocery stores, you look for a present for your daughter or your cousin or your niece. They're having a birthday coming up. And if it's a niece, there's a whole aisle of all pink toys and all pink stuff, very domesticated toys. And the next aisle over is a bunch of like violent stuff in blue and black and brown boxes that all are like axes and knives and guns and stuff, right? When you do that, you think about the learning environment, you are robbing people of their ability to self-express, which means you're robbing the whole environment of creativity, of the ability to have to find new answers to things, whatever, when you're restricting kids so much. I wish educators would think about this in terms of the environment needing to be open for everybody to be who they are so that you can have more learning, but we don't think of it that way. We are currently in an environment where we are passing laws that are specifically targeting trans athletes, trans students, for instance. We have schools. My friend Beth Hawkins, I was just talking to her yesterday because in prep for this show, she's been writing about these things for years. And I pulled up an article of hers from 2012 that she wrote. I didn't know it was that long. It's almost a decade old. There had been an outbreak of suicides in one of our school districts of gay students, specifically queer youth, and it was an epidemic of suicides at one school system. I mean, within one. And there was a law, or not a law, there was a rule on the books in that school system that teachers could not speak to students about anything that was related to their sexuality or related to their queerness, right? Like it was literally spelled out in the rules that educators could not speak to students. So if students came to you with anything they were struggling with, you couldn't. And it didn't come to a head until they had like an outbreak of suicides, right? That for me was jarring as a person who tries to learn, no matter where I sit in what community I'm in. That was jarring for me that there was literally that material consequence. Like it could really it could go that far to where you have a large group of students who have been living in a secret hell. Their parents didn't know about the secret hell that they were living in. And to be very honest with you, a lot of the adults around them, even if they would have known, they didn't care really.
Or they could have exacerbated it.
Or they could have exacerbated it or made it worse. So I'm thinking about, we're trying to do this friendly thing of trying to make schools open for everybody. That's great. Let's do that. Let's work on it. Inclusive schools and all that. At the same time, though, we're taking incoming heat with laws and rules that are specifically targeted at us not having humane education settings for all students, for queer youth. So I wonder what you think about the level of fight that we need to have, where on the one hand, we're trying to push a positive agenda. We're trying to make things open for everybody. On the other hand, we are taking incoming that's pretty aggressive, and we need some action around protecting young people, making sure that the rules and the laws are fair.
Yeah, my orientation in this space has always been, and I think about my experience as a kindergarten teacher, that we do what's in the best interest of our babies, those who are entrusted into our care. And if we are not thoughtful about how policies and practices support or don't support their cognitive, social, and emotional learning and development, then I don't know why we're in this space in the first place. Mm-hmm. Related to the question in the last year, there were more than 130 pieces of anti-trans legislation introduced across state legislatures. More than a third of them were codified. There are a number of state and federal court challenges.
Let's just stop for a second. Say that again. How many laws?
More than 130 introduced. More than a third of them, right? More than a third of them codified. And this again in the middle of a pandemic, right? At a time when people don't have portable water, when climate crisis is causing all kind of trauma, right? This on top of what Dr. Jordan Grew has been talking about for decades, which is the underlying psychological trauma that many of us simply deal with, right? Like all of that, and elected officials chose to prioritize passing legislation that targets children.
Wow.
Again, and I say that because before any of this legislation was introduced, and this is a copy and paste sort of right-wing, ALEC-funded attempt to politicize an issue to try and get people to go vote in this year's midterm elections. We should be clear about those politics. But the point here is that these laws were introduced on top of, again, the existing lack of protection that I talked about at the beginning of the conversation. Most of our babies who are soon to be LGBTQIA+, do not have the same physical protections as their peers in public schools now. And then these bills were introduced, and many of them do one of three things, if not a combination of the three or all three. They restrict the ability for students to participate in extracurricular programs and activities, which is, again, a focus of my research, which is asinine. We live in a country that spends millions of dollars at every level on extracurricular sports and programs because we understand that they are critical to helping young people develop. and to develop the skills that they need in order to thrive. And we're simply saying that there's a particular group of students, right, who are often the smallest in the percentage of students who we're identifying in schools who cannot be a part of any of that stuff. That's one. The second thing that it does is fundamentally change the relationship between children, their families, and their medical providers. Doctors take Hippocratic oaths to provide services to meet the needs of their children. Now there are statutes that fundamentally disrupt that. For kids who are trans or gender non-conforming, and denying, we've seen this in the reproductive rights space and in other spaces, denying people access to things that they want and or need is not going to prevent them from accessing them. It's simply going to make their experiences harder, which takes us back to where we started in terms of mental health. So for folks who want more, I encourage you to look at the Trevor Project. They have culled a lot of data in this space. NBJC 2 years ago now worked with the Congressional Black Caucus, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman, because all of what you mentioned regarding suicides is a problem for Black kids generally. So put sexual identity and gender orientation to the side for a second. Before the novel coronavirus pandemic started, Black kids were committing suicide at double the rate that they had been over the last 20 years, which to me is concerning in and of itself, but even more frustrating when you think about the fact that the rates for every other community of children have decreased. White kids, Latinx kids, Indigenous kids, AAPI kids, suicide rates are all decreasing. Black kids are increasing, again, before the pandemic. And then you layer on top of that, right? So we're talking about the stress associated with anti-Blackness, poverty, toxic stress, all of that. Layer on top of that LGBTQ bias and stigma. And the fact that our kids are saying that schools are hostile and unwelcoming spaces, it's often an untenable situation for them, right? So there was data from February 2020 that said that 66% of Black LGBTQ youth reported being depressed in the last year. 35% reported seriously considering suicide in the past 12 months. 19 reported a past year suicide attempt. Anybody knows anything about suicidal ideation? It's not a one-time thing. Our babies were sitting with these thoughts.
You just said 35% had considered
35%. And again, what I know about statistics is that this is likely underreported. So many of our babies are not going to even participate in a survey where you ask them about some gay shit. That's not the term that they're going to use.
Right.
And they also might not be trusting of adults that they don't have positive relationships with, which the data also bears out as the case for most of our babies, right? Remembering that the vast majority of the workforce is cishet white women who are out here caping for white boys under tiki torches and hoods, right? Like, so all this stuff matters and is connected. And what I find most frustrating is that adults who are thoughtful, who have the ability to access this research, who have degrees, credentials, and certificates, who spend time in spaces with folks like us who actually do this work, are willfully ignorant about the challenges that our babies endure and what they can do to be disruptive about it.
You know, this is one of the things that I have noticed and observed about you for a long time. And let me just say, like, to anybody listening and watching, you're joining Freedom Friday. We don't have Sharif El-Mekki with us yet this morning, but we have David Johns with us this morning, and we are manifesting Dr. David Johns with us this morning, true leader. But I saw what you just did there, David, and I want to call it out and I want to point to it. So you said all of our babies are experiencing these trends when it comes to suicide. It comes to suicidal ideation. You can add things there like depression, and then of course all the other stats around discipline and punishment and expulsions. All of those things, the stats are not in our favor. And for a long time, you have been concerned with all of our young people, right? But I want to ask you a very tough question around, in the justice community, the organizing community, the community of politics, and especially of Black politics, do you feel like it runs two ways enough? You are in the room expressing love and concern for all of our babies, but you are also representative of a population that catches a lot of hell in ways that maybe others aren't catching the hell. So you're being a universalist.
Yeah.
You're seeing like all of us, which I love. I love this about you. This is beautiful. I love it. At the same time, are we doing enough across other lines to make sure that that's reciprocal?
That's a question for you to answer, brother. I have thoughts about it, but
I want to hear your thoughts about it.
So I'm not going to answer the question about y'all's responsibility. And in this instance, y'all means cishet Black men in this context.
No. In this context, I'm just going to say, the larger justice community, period. People who are waking up every day talking about social and racial justice, thinking they're organizing something in the world.
So let me push on that though. Let me push
yeah.
on that. I'm gonna push on that because the larger social justice racial community is comprised of leaders like me.
Right.
Those who have been doing this work before it was sexy, before the summer of George Floyd, are often Black, queer, trans, non-binary people who don't get credit, who don't get invited on the platform, who aren't invited in the spaces that other people need to be in. That should be clear. So that I go back to, often in this space, who gets lifted up are cis, het folk, first white and then Black, who don't have the lived experience and then who haven't done the work to understand the importance of intersectionality, both as a theoretical framework and as a method, like a way to actually do this work. And it's problematic, right? So the part that I can't speak to is I spend a lot of time in traditional legacy civil rights spaces with folks like us in community, where folks want to have a conversation about Blackness and erase everything else that's important. The intra-community difference.
Right.
It is no regard for disability status, no regard for difference with regard to religion, no regard for difference with regard to sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression. It's in these spaces where cis het Black men in particular are most dangerous because it becomes about them and their issues. Conversely, I spent a lot of time in progressive LGBTQ spaces with white queer leaders, reminding them that you are often the worst arbiters of some of the things that you purport to want to get away from. Those two things are true, and it is still often my responsibility and the responsibility of other people who have my experiences to disrupt all of that. But what I want people to take away from this is that we live in the trenches. When we are not acknowledged, when we are not named, when other people, because of their privileges, have access to platforms and resources, it is still us who do this work. And that gets missed, right? You and I had part of this conversation, but I had more of it with Sharif. But when you all were talking about a version of this connected to my work and my intervention around Dave Chappelle's social commentary, it really fucking pissed me off because your colleague in particular dismissed my entire work history in this space around babies and made it about himself as a cishet Black man who feels attacked and persecuted. Octavia Butler told us a long time ago that it's cishet Black men who can't see past themselves that are most dangerous because they get closest to the center of power and forget about everything else.
And I want to title this portion of the conversation because so that people listening and watching know what we're talking about. Last year there was this big national dust up that everybody does know about with David Chappelle. He did a Netflix series. In that series, one of the problems that I had with it that I expressed in our show was I don't believe that when you have that type of platform that it's funny or that it's smart or incisive or brilliant or genius or whatever to use that platform to go off 3/4 of it to find a group of people to scapegoat for special attention. Let's talk about Mexicans for an hour. Let's just go in on Mexicans and talk about all the ways in which Mexicans are problematic. Let's talk about Palestinians for an hour, whatnot. My antennas go up the moment that becomes a thing that we start leading our flock to do. So when that came up last year, I felt like not having the tools though, like just being a person. I know what I was mad about, but I didn't have good critique about it. But now it's passed in some ways and people move on to the next controversy, except for you don't really move on from that. I wanted to ask you about that specifically, that point in time, the way that the Black village, the way that we as Black folks were experiencing that conversation, we're experiencing that teachable moment in time. What do you think was problematic about the discussion? What was problematic about our roles in how we were even experiencing that as a controversy? And what could we have done better as a village?
Yeah, so I won't start there. Let me start by celebrating, because we often start in deficit-based spaces. Let me start with that.
I'm starting with deficits. I choose violence. I want everybody to know right now. I love my people like David because they bring us back good. But I am sorry, I live in the violence. Go ahead, brothers.
So let me start with the asset, then we'll come into that. So it was really important for NBJC to be on record in naming intersectionality and that Black LGBTQIA+ people exist, for the reason that his platform is one of the largest in the world, and there's so many people who watch and consume it. And the reality is that I found myself preemptively getting ahead of what has become the alphabet people joke, knowing that I don't identify as gay. And I'm going to ask people to think about adopting another term because it's the one that makes me feel seen and valued and loved. And knowing that most people, a lot of Black people are going to roll their eyes like, there's already too many fucking letters. I don't want to learn another one. My point is, fine, I get your anxieties, and I'll let go of my letters when you let go of yours. There's a need for the LGBTQIA plus because you get to sit in your privilege, cis het bubble, and not have to worry about any of this stuff. So if we're going to have the conversation, let's have the conversation. The second thing is that it was important to us as an organization who for almost 20 years has been unapologetic and will continue to be unapologetic about talking about the needs of those of us at the intersection, to remind people that it was the deadliest year on record for trans folks. The deadliest year on record, the vast majority of trans folks who we know who were murdered, resulting in fatalistic violence, were Black trans women. And one of the hardest things for me is that in the 24 hours after we issued a statement that tried to make these points clear that most people never read, right? This is the environment we live in. Most people never read that. The article was circulated thousands of times, maybe hundreds of thousands of times. Within the week after the social commentary aired and this discussion was happening, there were 3 Black trans people who were murdered, 2 women and 1 man. We didn't get 1% of 1% of the coverage. We had an entire campaign called Stolen Lives. We just shared news yesterday about a Black trans woman we found out who was murdered at the end of last year. She was murdered trying to break up a fight. And this happens daily, right? So if there's one part of the social commentary I agree with is that some of us are sensitive. I'm sensitive about our people. I'm sensitive about all of the violence that we have to endure. And it was really important to say at a point in time in which the social commentary suggested and affirmed these myopic fantasies that all Black people are cisgender and heterosexual, which we've never been, and all LGBTQIA plus people are white, which they've never been, that we also exist. And that the lack of holding space for us and the lack of nuance provided in this social commentary that so many more people are going to consume than conversations like this, or when I was in the White House, are doing all of the things that I know how to do in this world, right? Like there's an imbalance that we need to be more and most mindful of. What I appreciated again about that moment is that there were some folks who leaned in and who were like, there has to be something here, right? Like it couldn't have been that it was just jokes, but then people felt comfortable dead naming, misgendering, and otherwise not talking to Black people with the same humanity that they otherwise demand for themselves, right? The converse of that is in moments when Black folks in particular who understand what it's like to be discriminated against simply because you have skin that's been kissed by the sun, like the moments of gaslighting where I know these issues are real, right? I know that there was a reason why so many people were sensitive. And I offer a footnote here, which is that the most difficult thing about all of this was what felt like this Black on Black violence. I'm a Black man in America, period, full stop. I never wanted to and will still live with what felt like performing cannibalization of another Black man. That wasn't the goal. But we as a people can never get free if we're not willing to check each other, hold each other accountable.
Yeah.
You just can't. It is unfathomable for me to think that people want to have the ability to be out here and say what the hell they want to say and then not want somebody else to do it. And so that was the thing. The last point that unnerved me the most was that there were some people like y'all's boy who was in this like unfettered space of like, let Dave Chappelle talk his talk. And then to your question, so when David Johns talks his talk, then what's the issue? And I listened to the episode. I'm pumping it again. I'm not gonna say his name. He and I had this conversation offline, but like 3 times, and I was incensed that one, he in particular spoke about me as if we were friends and we're not. There's something that happens in this space of proximal relationships where we assume things about people and then we talk about them in public and in private in ways that purport things about them that might not be real, and that really made me mad. And it made me mad in particular because that whole conversation was based on a single moment around my leadership of NBJC, and it disregarded that I've been in this space for a long time. The second thing that came up for me that was really frustrating was that like there was this entrenchment and concretizing around like Black men are the most harmed and vulnerable, and the conversation needs to begin and end there. And I go back to like we had that discussion around My Brother's Keeper, which is an acknowledgement that like yes, there are things that are unique about our experience, semicolon, and there's a lot more to talk about, right? Which is that like not all Black men show up in the same way, and there's a lot of diversity to talk about between and amongst us. And Black women and girls are continually persecuted and disregarded, and violence is enacted upon them by these systems in ways that we don't talk about. It took me back to being really pissed off that so many people would say for every one white male suspended or expelled K through 12, the rate is 3 times higher for Black boys, and then just stop.
And not see the fullness of all the stats.
And my question was, what about the girls? And then it's like, oh, the rate for girls is 6 times higher. Yeah. So like, yes, there are things that are unique to the way that we show up, and that I, as a Black man, I wrote my undergraduate thesis about just us. And it's not just us in this community. And so I want your boy to start in that space. And then like we expect from our students to grow past it. You should be able to step outside.
Well, let me say this too.
Moment and ask yourself some more critical questions.
I feel like, so a couple of things. Number one, I feel like we lost. If that was considered a battle, that Dave Chappelle blow up controversy thing. And when I say we, those of us who want to identify however the hell we want to identify to make our lives have meaning for ourselves and to live our own lives and live our best lives and not have anybody put any confines on our freedom of who we are going to be, long as we are not hurting anybody else. Because I put myself in that camp of people. I don't care what you think about my life and how I live and how I identify, how I dress, how I live, who I care about, who I love or whatnot. That is your problem if you have a problem with however I do anything. I've always been this way. I've been this way. This is the Chris Stewart way of living my life. I've been this way, right? It doesn't require any permission for anybody. So if someone wants to stand on stage and use their platform to talk to millions of people to point me out as somebody who's the problem, I feel like that's a fight. That's a real fight, because now you can be ignorant by yourself. But when you start engaging millions of people to be ignorant with you, and a few things that I saw come out of that I feel are very dangerous. One, it became popularized and popular to do what he was doing, for one. I hate celebritizing things that are bad ideas, because then all of a sudden you have a nation of morons who are starting to become dangerous people for my life. Like now all of a sudden I can't walk how I want to walk or be who I want to be. So that's the first problem that I'm having in that situation. The second problem I'm having in that situation is he was developing new partnerships by being that illiberal. Yeah. By being that illiberal, he was starting to connect people who considered themselves to be hip hop straight Black men, right, with Joe Rogan, right-wing white men. Right. So all of a sudden now you're building a new coalition of the morons that didn't exist before. Right. And I think as a people, Black folks, I want to say, I don't want to talk about us like we're any more anything than anybody else in terms of like we're more homophobic than anybody else, or I don't want to talk about us that way. But I do want to say this. We do have a problem with what I consider to be parasocial relationships, which are, we love our celebrities so much that we think they're our friends and our cousins and our brothers. We think Jay-Z is our cousin. We think that Dave Chappelle is our boy. Dave Chappelle wouldn't know us from a can of paint if he met us, but we've been knowing him so long that if we met him, we would feel like we were meeting somebody we knew our whole lives. So if he does something, we want to defend him. We want to protect him or whatnot. No, Dave Chappelle is a celebrity with a multi-million dollar platform. So when he has a bad idea, that bad idea is way more dangerous than if I have it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I feel like we may have lost in that situation, because I'm still seeing the right wing white coalition with the straight Black male coalition developing a new popularization of these ideas that not everybody gets to be who they want to be, right? Like, the libs, the liberals, the alphabet mafia, all that type of stuff. I don't have to be in one of those scapegoated communities to feel that it's dangerous for me and for all of us. If you do it to them, you're gonna do it to me.
Yes, and at the risk of being persnickety, to push the point, I can even receive people thinking I, as a grown man, a representative of a national advocacy organization, that my thoughts and feelings don't matter as much. But there was then a point where it shifted, and there were students at the high school that he went to who were saying to him that his words and actions caused and contributed to harm. And so let's just move away from all of the other social noise. I don't understand how one can purport to do the work of being an educator or care about Black folks and or consider oneself a social justice warrior and not be compelled by the words of our babies who are forced to go to, and this is the thing that I still sit with and it pisses me off, in part because we've done work with Duke Ellington High School, but that adults allowed a multi-millionaire to stand on a stage where the power imbalance is just so fucking off and say to them, your feelings and thoughts don't matter, incenses me. It incenses me. And in particular, because I know after having interviewed students at that school that some of us have this idea that like certain schools in a major metropolitan space like Washington, D.C., or a performing arts school like Duke Ellington will be even more safe and supportive for our babies, and it's the exact opposite.
But I'm going to do something here that you won't do, David. I'm going to do something that you won't do. See, I think your positivity is toxic. This is what I think. This is why you need to join violence with me.
Listen, wait. Time out. Let's expand this. Yeah. To be clear, have no problem choosing violence. I will be 40 next month, so I'm still trying to. I like to.
You have to master violence.
I'm not excited about that. Spending the night in jail, but I'm not afraid of it.
Yeah.
I just like to. I want to be more thoughtful about the battles that I'm choosing, in particular when I'm choosing violence. Because I'm from Inglewood, California. If it's gonna be violence, it's gonna be scorched earth. Like,
I did not know you were from Inglewood. I did not know that. Really?
See, people get all this, like, 6'5", this, skin tone and this curly hair and these nails fucked up. I'm from Inglewood, California. And then layer on top of that, I'm a Black, same-gender-loving man. I'm happy to choose violence when necessary.
Well, let me choose violence in this one way, because when I talk about the danger of parasocial relationships with celebrities, I think there was something preventing some of us from even coming to the idea that, to me, just seems very honest. Maybe Dave Chappelle is not a good person. Maybe Dave Chappelle is an asshole, right? Who actually earned what he has in life, not because he's some sort of noble being. He's some sort of person that has some, like, we use words like genius too loosely. We give it to everybody. Right, Richard Pryor was a genius. Paul Mooney was a genius. Right, these are genius, insightful social commentary people. But what's that?
Kanye West, not so much.
Kanye West, not so much. As a matter of fact, Kanye West is exactly the example of what I'm talking about. We have parasocial. We call him genius loosely.
I'm picking up what you put down.
Some of these people are actually assholes and morons who became famous for being that. And we want to, we want to own everybody. They're all our brothers. They're all our sisters. No, there's a point at which you cross over. I'm not owning Candace Owens. I'm sorry, you can have her.
We don't even speak on her. I don't disagree with you generally. However, specific to Dave Chappelle, and I don't know the man, never met him a day in my life. Extended invitation to have a conversation with him in public or in private still exists. I don't think that that's the case. I think that, and this is much more informed by my research and my work, that he, like many other people, are struggling to make sense of things and are acting out rather than inviting people in to help them do it.
I just want my audience to say, when I talk about toxic positivity, see, you just engaged in all kinds of grace.
No, this ain't that. I just said that when I heard your boy speaking on my name, I called him and said, keep my name out your mouth. Toxic when I need to.
Yeah, and I want to say this too, because you have referenced, and you've been referencing the 8 Black Hands show that we did last year, where we talked about this topic. And I want to say that's where
why didn't we talk about the topic? You tried to talk about the topic, and boy kept talking about me, which I still find flummoxing. Not really the word.
Well, and I think part of this, let's if I want to be real about that part of it, you were one of the only people, I think, nationally on a platform who was challenging in any type of intelligent way the David Chappelle situation, right? And your organization put out, I saw you get dragged on Twitter. I saw your name and your organization get dragged by people that were having, they were in deep, loving parasocial relationships with David Chappelle. So they felt it their need to discount all of your work that you were doing. So you actually became a proxy for the defense, right? Like, so I could see in a way where it was you versus David in some people's minds or heads. But even on our show, for our case, we are 4 Black men that come together on Sunday nights to do something that we think 4 Black men and many more Black men should be doing, which is to talk about the education of our young people, our 8 million Black children in schools. And we are bringing very different political, religious, social positions and life stories to that weekly call that we're navigating, that weekly barbershop discussion that we're having, which I think in some ways becomes the village, family, community look at what our broader Black conversation amongst Black men is, right? So we were representative of like a larger group of Black men that would be treating the issue the exact same way, whether problematic or insightful or struggling, right? Like when you just said Dave's struggling, you gave him that grace to be struggling or whatnot. Dave's struggling with hundreds of millions of dollars. Some of us are struggling with still living in the place where we're trying to evolve from, right? Like mentally, socially, whatever. So I give him less grace. Anyways, I don't want to go on some long rant about that, but I do want to say that I love all my brothers. I give grace to those
toxic
of us
positivity.
Right. So I will be toxic. I will be toxically positive about those close to me that I'm trying to build the movement for our freedom with, even when we're having problematic behavior. The Black Panthers had problematic behavior in their midst. The civil rights movement had problematic behavior.
White folks that don't have it. Yeah, I received that.
Yeah. We had, and just to be very real with you, Dr. David, and I'm going to bring Sharif in after this. There's 2 things, and we don't have a lot of time, but I so wanted to get to this one point with you. But number one, your art, my son saw your art on the back on your wall there and said, you have dope art. But I want to say you need to come back and we need to have a conversation about Bayard. Because there could be some longer conversations we can have about how
yes, and consider this. When you think about him, think about bisexual, bi, not bae.
I think he lives in a place in the intersections between white and Black and others, where we would have to talk about there's some problematic stuff to consider. Yeah.
I'm not talking about his sexuality, I'm talking about pronouncing his name.
Oh, I got you. So say it again. I'm sorry. Say your point again.
Bi instead of bae. Bayard Rustin.
Yeah. Okay. Bayard Rustin. Okay. Got you. And I'm bringing Sharif in. Sharif El-Mekki has made it to Freedom Friday. How you doing, brother?
Man, happy New Year. Good to see y'all. Look, I tried from the ride, and I'm just like, yo, can you turn that down? Says, hey, I left my earphones. I was like, I'm gonna bring the quality of this show down substantially if I try to do this from the car. So
never.
Good to see you. Good to see you. You talk about the art. Like David got some kind of I don't know who it was, but they like shouted him out like as amongst the top background, aesthetics or whatever. And I was like, man, I could,
oh, you mean
all the trash judges? Y'all give me on Sunday nights. And then I saw his, I'm like, he should be giving y'all trash. You know what I mean?
Bruh, he got rated with room, like it was like the people who look at your background in your room and rate you, and he got rated highly. Look at all this damn work I do.
So look at all this. Here's the funny thing about that, which is that the first time they did that, it was an MSNBC hit. And I was like, it was a 9 out of 10, in part because there was no art on this wall. This is not the piece that was supposed to be here. There's another piece that not framed. And so that was like the second time they did it. I was like, okay, this is what we expect. So that was a nice moment for me. Yeah. But and to intersectionality's point, these pieces were produced by Black Saved and Loving Women, members of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Alpha Chapter, Rachel and Rebecca Crouch. This one features 5 leaders that NBJC honored, including Miss Major, Black trans woman who is central to a lot of the victories that people celebrate in both legacy civil rights spaces and LGBTQ spaces. And so it's nice for me to sit there's a parallel piece with brothers, male-identified folks on this wall, but it's nice for me to sit in this space, to your point, Chris, and be reminded that I'm never by myself in spite of what it might feel like.
Well, Room Raiders, you have an open invitation to come and, check out some work that some folks have done. I know we're coming to an end and landing the plane. The one question, I hope you will come back. I hope you will be a friend of the show and that we can talk to you from time to time. about your work and about what is moving forward. One of the things that we didn't get to, and I don't know if there's a 1 minute, 2 minute way to do this, but because you are studying right now, you're in your doctorate program. I know you're having to live in a lot of data and information and literature and research. And it was a burning question for me earlier. Maybe it's not for anybody else listening, but as you encounter, kind of like you mentioned Asa Hilliard, but I know you're encountering a lot of other literature. If you're noticing a similar blind spot to the youth and the people that we have been talking about in this show, even in that literature, even in our academic heroes, our people that we point to a lot as being the forefathers of like our academic work, if you're seeing the same blind spot there too.
Yeah, most definitely. My work tries to bring together three concentric circles that are otherwise disparate. And one is work that's focused on Black youth, that's often coded as urban, are poor, which again suggests that there's a monolith that we all exist in major metropolitan spaces, don't have a relationship with our father, like all of the bad things that we know about how quantitative data has been used. There's another ring of data that focuses on the experiences of LGBTQ youth. It's often not inclusive of educational experiences. It's most often focused on behavioral health, think sexual wellness, predictive patterns and behaviors. But it misses that kids show up in lots of different spaces, and we need to connect those dots. And then the third ring that tries to bring the two of those closer, but then misses intersectionality is around informal educational programs and activities. So brilliant sister, a friend of mine, Bianca Baldridge, has literally written a book about how these programs are part of the legacy of Black folks who never really fully trusted schools to do the work of supporting our babies cognitively, socially, and emotionally. And this is a space where folks do the work that y'all do, right? Sharif, that I saw you build in Philly and elsewhere. And for me, the most important thing to highlight that's being missed is that Black LGBTQIA plus kids who are assumed to be, might be at some point, have always existed, and they're forced to move through spaces where adults, whether they be youth workers, educators, just caring and concerned adults, have opportunities and I argue obligation to be more thoughtful about how to show up for them.
That's dope. You got such a dope thing going on, man. I appreciate you. Let's breathe him in, everybody. Let's just breathe in the brilliance that is David Johns. We eulogized him at the beginning. David Johns, who we are manifesting as Dr. David Johns, soon to be, is the executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition. David, do you want to tell people how they can find you if they want to find you, your work, or just connect?
Yeah, I talk a lot of shit across digital platforms around freedom and liberation at Mr. David Johns. NBJC is NBJC on the move across platforms, and the website is NBJC, National Black Justice Coalition.org.
I appreciate you, brother. You've been the leader that we need in so many ways for so many years. You are leading, I think, a rare revolution, and you're the only one, I think, standing in it, even though you're going to be toxic positive and you're going to say, oh, no, there's all these other people and we all like blah, 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 no, whatever. I'm literally going to tell you, you are standing alone in a level of leadership or in terms of example for a young person that is looking up right now. It's you. And you can go ahead and try and give it to everybody else and you'll be all positive and everything. But I'm choosing violence. Right.
This is my Beyonce moment. I receive it.
Yeah. And the reason I need you to receive it and to live it and be it is because I do believe that proximity is what creates the next generation of leaders and leadership. People see examples and they look up. So there's someone proximate to you right now who is watching how you move, how you think, and what you do. And they are going to be liberally taking from your example into their own. And that's how the next generation happens. So we need you. We need you to keep being you and do your thing. Sharif, brother, appreciate you for making it in, even as you had, I think, something going on this morning where I probably would have just skipped it, just to be real with you, because but I know you wanted to be here. So appreciate you too, brother.
No, thanks a lot. And sorry, missed it, but looking forward to David coming back. And the one thing that I did want to share, just as a principal and school leaders, one of the meetings that I distinctly remember was talking to some students who were, LGBTQIA, I heard you say. And they were talking about being bullied in the school that I was responsible for in multiple ways. But it wasn't just the bullying, because I know kids sometimes are, make, poor decisions, right? But sometimes that bullying was actually being modeled by some of the teachers on my staff. And I say that because what was most disheartening was that the students were relaying anecdotes of how adults were either ignoring or finding amusement in their pain, in their abuse. And so I had a staff meeting to bring this up and to address it. And there were a couple of teachers that said, well, I don't agree with their lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And and it shocked me. This is my first year as a principal, mind you. And I'm just like, most of these people, I was younger than most of the people in this room, and it just took me aback. I'm like, wait a minute, I just want to be clear. Like, I just relayed painful stories, situations under our watch in this community that we're talking all this rhetoric stuff about, humanity, and you're saying that you don't care. I've held on to that, for my entire principalship, because to me that was, fundamental, that this was happening under our watch, by folks who were supposedly charging forward in the defense of children, but they could not see the humanity of this group of children who were suffering so in their classrooms. And I think that rage has just stuck with me, throughout that time. The audacity. I was pissed off. And the thing about it was, they weren't even effective educators. I mean, these were people that eventually had moved out anyway. But I'm just like, wait a minute, y'all are like the worst of this group of educators, in here. Yet this is the banner that you want to carry?
Yeah.
Right. No.
There's I went back to my data. So one of the students, Aubrey, talks about, what was the question? She says, high school is much better than middle school. At middle school, I had no resources. I wasn't allowed to use the girls' bathroom. I was not allowed to use a chosen name, really. There was just a lot of what I guess would boil down to calling bullshit. Just so much systematic exclusion and lack of investment in my education, in my safety, in my comfort, in my thriving. And although that kind of shifted a little bit in high school, because I did have a system of support, for example, being allowed to use my chosen name, being allowed to use a girl's bathroom and things like that, the bullshit was not being understood by my teachers, not being understood entirely by my classmates. She goes, I skipped down. And so the thing that was annoying about high school was that there were these supports, and it was such an artistic school, but at the end of the day, I still got assaulted. And while I was bleeding, the kid walked off and said, oh, well, that doesn't matter because that's a fucking man. And, he didn't even get suspended. And that's what frustrated me. There were so many things. There was so much harm that took place at the school because people didn't understand who I was, and that frustrated them. This same student goes on later to talk about, it's not just that there are some educators who don't agree, whatever the fuck that means. That pisses, I don't give a fuck if you don't agree. I'm gonna show up in the way that I was purposed to show up. And the sad reality is that our babies don't have the ability to say this to an adult. They get kicked out, they get suspended, they get expelled. But this student and others also talked about that it was teachers who resented them. Because this is a student who teachers say by the standards and the sorting and selecting that we do, that they're not deserving of these opportunities. They're not deserving of the ability to thrive. And this is a student, like most of us, who figured it out, who had solutions that worked for them in a system that was not designed for them. And so there are stories I have of middle school students being told by grown adults that they are problems. That's a deep trauma that we as adults have to deal with. And this is why I have no issue calling adults in or out with love or with animus, because we have resources and tools and things to use when our babies don't. And too often these experiences that they have that break them, that are designed to break them, don't get unearthed.
It's so interesting that you said where I started my principalship was a middle school. And so that, I had not made that connection. That'll be interesting if that's like a actual theme. And middle school is already, as we know, just human growth and development wise, challenging time for youth. And this was all, and mind you, this is
a challenging time for the adults. It's a transitional chime for the youth
Yeah.
because if you look at a lot of statistics around discipline and push outs and all that stuff, middle schools where all hell breaks loose. And it's because number one, we do middle school wrong in the United States, and we have a bunch of poorly trained people who are in a transitional time of young people, but they're problematizing that their systems are problematizing that transitional time for young people. And the story that you just told, David, I want to end on this. I think the story that you just told is the story I want to tell. Is there's a real person with a real voice who is having a real experience somewhere that is representative of many people who are having to fight to be who they want to be and who they need to be just naturally every day in their life. And they are surrounded by either morons or mistrained people or people who say really stupid things like, I don't agree with your lifestyle or those type of things. And they are alienated and alone in some ways. And they have a couple of options: succumb and accommodate the dysfunction around them and become what people want them to become and be untrue to themselves. Or two, become a statistic in other ways that people who do self-harm become because the system has driven you to be that way. Or three, to be fiercely themselves and to stop caring what people think and become one of those people that breaks out, a breakout personality type. The breakout personality type is like, I'm still going to be me no matter what y'all want to do, blah, blah, whatever. Those are a couple of routes that are afforded to them. But right now, there's a lot of them, right? There's a lot of them. I love these individual stories that gives us a gateway into this is, I think, a secret hidden problem for many people, and we need to fight for them. I appreciate you, brothers. I know we got to land this plane. Black folks don't know how to end a show. Prince don't know how to end a song. He be having like 8, 9, 10-minute songs sometimes.
They be good, though. They be good to the last second.
They be good. They do be good. But you be like, well, damn, brother, I'm
glad you're starting 2022. I'm glad you're starting so strong. David, no matter what the conversation is, Prince seeps in, like no matter what. Like
either Prince or the Matrix.
Prince is appropriate. I'm gonna send to you all a clip. Prince was on it wasn't not Star Search. What's the one with the white guy?
The Voice.
No, not this is long time ago. This would have been when Prince was like maybe 17, because it was one of his first albums, and what he talked about was that he had penned the songs 4 years prior, but the studio didn't trust him to produce it, and he did all. So all this to say that I've been thinking and sitting with Prince because Prince is a genius who was surrounded by people who didn't understand his genius. And he was one of those folks who broke out and who said, I'm going to be me in spite of the fact that y'all don't understand it and you won't understand it. The challenge for me is that Prince exists in a rarefied space where queerness is sometimes tolerated. And again, I didn't talk about him being a queer person. I'm talking about queerness. The ways he showed up was queer. Look up the term ontologically, right? But it should not be the case that we have to be performers, e.g. Lil Nas X, shout out to Montero, or hairdressers or otherwise parts of teams that make people feel better for our identity to be celebrated or otherwise honored as something that we should all be working to protect.
See, now y'all gonna get me like on a tangent, and as I'm trying to end the show, but I do want to say this. When I talked earlier about celebritizing the wrong ideas, I grew up in an era with Prince and Grace Jones and David Bowie and Rick James and Michael Jackson and others who were breaking down a lot of gender norms, even though it wasn't considered to be that. Boy George, I was a huge Boy George fan. I was a huge Culture Club Prince fan, whatever. And I wrote about this last year for a program that I was in. I did a program last year that required me to do a biomythography. And in my biomythography, I looked at work by Audre Lorde and others to help construct this. How did I construct my own identity, my own gender identity, my own gender norms? And Prince and Grace Jones and David Bowie and others figured very prominently in that. I had to go back and think through what they were doing in that era, in that time. And it's funny that we did not know that. I think Boy George at one point said, of course I'm straight. I would rather have tea than sex or something like that, as he's got a full face of makeup or whatnot. George Michael was doing the same thing back then or whatnot. And we were okay with their gender bending, personas, as long as they just didn't say that they were, like living the lifestyle. I just think it's so weird, but it was educational for me to write about it last year. You're right, Sharif. Prince and the Matrix are going to make it in every one of our episodes in some way, shape, or form. But today we included David Bowie, Rick James, George Michael, and others who actually were celebritizing the right way, I think, of thinking years ago. So I could feel like an old man be like, we conquered this in the 80s, you know, but we didn't really. So, all right, y'all. Appreciate you. Go ahead, Sharif.
I was just gonna to add a little bit as you close.
Bro, you keep adding stuff. I'm trying to get in this place.
I know, but we can close out right after this, because if not, it's going to agitate me. The group of some of the folks who were allowing and celebrating middle school children being bullied, 12, 13-year-olds, also used to do this performative prayer circle in the hallway. When the bell rang every morning too.
Yeah.
Right. And so the complexities of like what people and the misunderstanding and of humanity and there's a saying like, teach me your religion without opening your tongue, without opening your mouth.
Yeah.
Show me how you treat his creation in different ways. Show me how you present towards humanity, how you show up for the aggrieved. To me, all of that, and that those are the two things that always just stuck with me and that I think about. And this was all before I even knew suicide rates, homelessness rates, abuse rate, I didn't know any of that. I was totally ignorant of that experience. I was just like, yo, what the hell? Children are being bullied in your class and you're laughing? Like, You know what I mean? Like, so anyway.
This now is going back to me. This is the energy I'm on in 2022, which is just be honest about it. If you care about Black folks that look like you or affirm your existence, then just say so. But don't be out here purporting to care about all of us. Mm-hmm. Just be clear about where you are, so I know where to place you. We can move you to the side. Mm-hmm. And the rest of us who actually care about actual liberation work, which requires all of us to be free, can actually focus on that. I just want us to be clear about the terms. And I really, really want adults who have the ability and authority to lovingly or otherwise check folks who are playing these games to do so.
Yeah, don't do it with love. They don't deserve it. All right, y'all. So choose violence. We learn in peace on Freedom Fridays. We learn in peace, but we choose violence sometimes. Today has been a great way to kick off the new year. We have David Johns, who will return as a friend of the show, I am sure, because we're going to have conversations about religion. We're going to have conversations about academics that pertain to his work as he moves forward. So I'm putting it out there in the world that we will keep talking. We appreciate all of you that spend some of your time with us. To be very honest with you, to get any group of people that are willing to give up some of their morning and some of their time, their brunch time, to think about how we do better for young people and how we create systems that are fair to them and help them get a humane education is time well spent. So we appreciate you for doing it. We will see you again next week on Freedom Friday. This has been another episode of Freedom Friday. You're still not free, but hopefully you're freer now than you were when we began. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you guys next week.